8 years. That's how long I'd been chasing ghosts through Chicago's underbelly, piecing together a puzzle that nobody wanted me to solve. My father disappeared when I was 18 years old. One day he was there, the next day he was gone. No note, no explanation. Just official papers saying he was dead, and a city that seemed determined to forget he'd ever existed. The police called it a closed case. My mother called it a tragedy, and never recovered. I called it a lie, and I built my entire career around proving it. By the time I turned 28, my investigation had consumed most of my life. I'd taken on freelance writing assignments, pieces about urban development, city corruption, anything that paid rent on my apartment and left me enough time to dig deeper into the things that mattered. My editor at the Tribune thought I was wasting potential on small stories. He didn't know about the real work. Nobody knew. The connection started appearing in 2017. 12 people disappeared over a decade. All of them connected to one organization, the Sassolini family. All of them worked in various capacities: construction, logistics, administrative roles. All of them vanished without trace or explanation. Official records said they moved away, changed careers, relocated to different states. But when I tracked their families, dug through property records and financial documents, the pattern became undeniable. They didn't leave. They were erased. At the center of everything was Gabriel Sassolini, 35 years old. Took control of the organization after his grandfather retired. Handsome in that dangerous way. The kind of face that appeared in society pages and criminal databases with equal frequency. He was untouchable, connected to police, to politicians, to people with power that existed in the spaces between law and chaos. My apartment walls told the story in photographs and red string. Maps of Chicago marked with locations where people disappeared. Bank transfers that didn't make sense. Security footage from businesses near the docks, pixelated and grainy, showing figures that might have been something or might have been nothing. The kind of evidence that would make any lawyer laugh me out of a room, but the kind of pattern that kept me awake at night. I'd been working through the night again, staring at my screen, cross-referencing construction permits with property ownership records. A warehouse scheduled for demolition had caught my attention. No official permits on file. No documentation that suggested it should exist. But it did exist. I'd driven past it twice. It was real, concrete, and steel and rust, defying the bureaucratic erasure someone had attempted. The smart choice was to hire a private investigator, to go to the police, to approach my editor with something concrete instead of conspiracy theories. But smart choices had never been my strength. Besides, going through official channels meant people would know I was asking questions. It meant someone could stop me before I found answers. October 15th, Wednesday evening. The forecast predicted rain moving in from the west, but the sky already looked angry, dark in a way that suggested the storm would arrive sooner than expected. I parked 3 blocks from the warehouse, in an industrial area where nobody paid attention to unfamiliar cars. I wore dark clothes, nothing threatening, nothing that screamed investigator, just a woman with a camera and a notebook. Someone who might be doing urban photography or research for a writing project. Innocuous. Invisible. The warehouse sat silent when I approached. No lights, no visible security. But absence of security was its own kind of warning. Professional operations didn't leave anything to chance. If this place had no obvious protection, it meant the important protection was invisible. I made it inside through a side door that had been welded shut decades ago, but was actually just painted that way. The interior was hollow, cavernous, filled with the smell of rust and abandonment, and something else underneath that I couldn't identify. I moved carefully, documenting everything with my camera. Storage containers with serial numbers. Equipment. The kind of infrastructure that suggested business, but what kind of business remained unclear. I was so focused on photographing details that I almost missed the sound. Footsteps. Multiple people. Professional, coordinated movement. They weren't trying to hide. They were hunting, and they knew the space well enough not to worry about noise discipline. My heart began moving faster. I moved toward the back of the warehouse, calculating distances and exits. The back wall had a service door that led to the loading area. Beyond that, The Chicago River ran black and industrial. I'd scouted it weeks earlier, a way out that seemed impossible until you understood that impossible was sometimes your only option. I started moving faster. The footsteps behind me accelerated. They'd seen me, or they'd noticed movement, or they'd expected someone and confirmed their suspicions. The calculation didn't matter anymore. Only escape mattered. The loading dock was empty. The night air hit my face. Cold. Damp with coming rain. The drop to the riverside access was further than I'd remembered. Maybe 4 meters. Survivable if you didn't think too hard about the landing, about what the water might contain, about whether anyone could reach you once you were in it. Behind me, I heard the service door open. Voices called out, urgent and sharp. I didn't think. Thinking was for people who had time. I moved to the edge, measured the distance with a glance, and jumped. The fall lasted maybe 2 seconds, but felt eternal. The water arrived like impact with solid concrete, cold that didn't feel like cold anymore. It was erasure. It was pain translated into something beyond pain. It was the absence of everything familiar. My lungs seized, my muscles locked. I kicked toward the surface, toward the concept of oxygen. But the river was moving faster than I could swim. The current pulled me downstream, spinning me, disorienting my sense of direction. Water in my mouth. Water in my lungs. This is what drowning feels like, I thought with surprising clarity. This is how it ends. 8 years of investigation, and it ends in a river in the dark, where nobody will ever know what happened to me. Then hands. Powerful hands gripping my jacket, pulling upward with force that seemed impossible. I broke the surface, gasping, coughing, my body convulsing as it tried to process oxygen again. I was being dragged toward the bank, away from the current, toward solid ground. A figure, silhouetted against the lights of the property behind him. A large property, secured, with guards I hadn't known existed. "You're all right," a voice said. Deep, rough, close to my ear. "You're safe," he said, eyes still sweeping the street. "Eyes on me. Breathe. I've got you." But I wasn't all right. I was choking on my own survival. My vision swam. The man holding me was moving me toward the bank with efficiency that suggested he'd done this before, or he'd been trained for emergencies, or he simply knew what needed to happen next. He pulled me onto the concrete, and I coughed up river water, gasping like something that had forgotten how to breathe. My hands were shaking. My entire body was shaking. Through the blur of shock and cold and adrenaline, I tried to focus on his face, and something in that face, the structure of it, the intensity of his eyes, the way he was looking at me, triggered a memory, a fragment from before my father disappeared, a photograph I hadn't thought about in years. A man in my living room, laughing with my father, speaking in Italian. My lips moved. I wasn't planning to speak. The name came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, from muscle memory and subconscious recognition. The cognomen my father had used when he still existed. The name he'd whispered in our house before everything changed. Phantom, I breathed. Barely audible, barely more than reflex. The man froze. His hands, which had been supporting me, went absolutely still. His expression changed. Something flickering across his face like a switch being thrown. Recognition. Shock. Understanding. All of it compressed into a single moment. He knew. Somehow, impossibly, this man knew exactly what that name meant. And the realization that I'd just identified myself, revealed myself, placed myself completely at his mercy, hit me with more force than the river. Consciousness returned in fragments. The feeling of soft fabric beneath my cheek, the hum of air conditioning. Voices somewhere distant, speaking Italian too quickly for my drowsy mind to process. I wasn't in the river anymore. That much registered first. Then came the panic. My eyes opened to a bedroom that cost more money than I'd made in the last 3 years. High ceilings, minimalist furniture, the kind of space designed by someone who understood that emptiness projected power. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked manicured grounds, and, beyond them, a wall topped with security cameras. Not subtle ones, the kind meant to be seen. I sat up too quickly, and my body reminded me exactly how cold that river had been. Every muscle ached. My lungs felt scraped raw. My clothes were gone, replaced with a silk robe that probably had a designer name I couldn't pronounce. I was clean. Someone had cleaned me while I was unconscious. The violation of that realization hit harder than the fear. The bedroom door opened without warning. He filled the doorway completely. Gabriel Sassolini, the man from the warehouse. In daylight, without water streaming down his face, he looked even more dangerous. The scar that traced his mandible caught the light as he studied me. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they held the expression of someone accustomed to never being surprised. Except, he looked surprised. Or something close to it. "You're awake," he said. Not a question. His accent was subtle but present. Italian underneath American English. "You've been asleep for nearly 16 hours. I pulled the robe tighter. "Where am I?" "Safe." He crossed the room with measured steps. "The question is why you were at that warehouse." "I don't know what you're talking about." The lie came reflexively, but his expression didn't change. He'd expected it. He stood at the window, silhouetted against the morning light, and I had the strange sensation of being assessed by something far more dangerous than a man. A force. An entity. "You whispered a name," he continued, still not looking at me, "when I pulled you from the river. A name nobody has used in 10 years. A name that belonged to someone I knew very well." My throat constricted. My mind raced through explanations, justifications, ways to deny what he clearly already knew. The only sound was my own breathing. "Your father," Gabriel said quietly. He turned then, and his eyes met mine with such intensity that I had to look away. "Marcus Richardson. Phantom. You called him that. I don't know what you mean. He was my closest friend, my business partner. Then one day he vanished, left no note, no explanation, no goodbye." Gabriel moved closer, and I pressed myself backward into the headboard. 8 years later, his daughter appears in a warehouse she shouldn't know about, investigating the organization I run. Calling his old codename in a moment of panic. "Tell me, Jessica. May I call you Jessica?" How am I supposed to interpret that? I said nothing. The truth was too complicated, too dangerous, too connected to things I didn't fully understand. Gabriel seemed to accept my silence as answer enough. He turned back to the window. "I'm not going to hurt you. If I wanted you dead, you'd already be dead. Instead, I fished you out of a river." He paused, though I'm not entirely sure why. The implication hung between us. He'd saved me on impulse. The realization that he might regret it was almost worse than the threat of violence would have been. "I want to leave," I said. "No, you don't. You can't keep me here." Gabriel glanced at me over his shoulder, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "Actually, I can. I own this property. I control this estate, and enough of the surrounding blocks to make you very easy to find. I own the local police captain, the mayor, and 3 state representatives. I can keep you here for as long as I decide is necessary." He returned his attention to the window. "But I'm not going to. You're free to walk out whenever you choose. The door is unlocked. The gates will open. You'll make it approximately 15 minutes before my people pick you up, and then the situation becomes considerably more complicated than it currently is. So the question isn't whether you can leave. It's whether you should." He left after that, closing the door behind him with careful softness. Not a slam. Not a threat. Worse, somehow. I waited 30 seconds before I was out of bed and moving. The bathroom was attached to the bedroom, and I found clothes laid out on a marble counter. Carefully chosen. Tan linen pants, a cream-colored sweater, shoes in burnt brown leather. Everything in earth tones. Nothing that stood out, nothing that drew attention. He dressed me in invisibility. I moved through the halls of his home like a ghost. The architecture was exactly what I'd expected from someone like him. Cold, expensive, designed to intimidate. Modern art on the walls that probably had significant price tags. Furniture that looked uncomfortable by design. Everything screaming wealth in languages that didn't require words. The library found me as much as I found it. 2 stories tall, books from floor to ceiling, a rolling ladder, The kind of space that suggested someone actually read, actually thought, actually experienced the world beyond violence and money. I moved deeper into the stacks, running my fingers along spines, and that's when I saw it. A photograph, framed, sitting on a shelf between first editions and leather-bound antiques. The glass was old, the image faded slightly, but the moment it captured was undeniable. 3 figures. A man I'd know anywhere, despite 10 years of absence. My father. Younger than I'd ever known him, his face unlined, his smile genuine. Next to him stood Gabriel, decades younger, but recognizable in the structure of his face, the intensity of his eyes. And between them, small and laughing, was me, 8 years old, before the abandonment, before the disappearance, before I learned that fathers could simply choose to evaporate. The photograph fell from my hand. I don't remember dropping it. I don't remember sinking to the floor. I remember only the sensation of the world tilting, of memories that I'd buried so deep I'd nearly convinced myself they were fiction, suddenly clawing their way back to the surface. I'd been in this room. This man had known my father. They'd been close enough to be photographed together. Close enough that my childhood self had apparently trusted him completely. I was still on the floor when Gabriel found me. He stood in the doorway, and his expression changed the moment he saw me. The predator softened, just slightly, into something almost like regret. "I should have put that away," he said quietly. I couldn't respond. My throat had closed around words I didn't have. Gabriel crossed the room and knelt beside me, not touching, just being present. His proximity triggered something else, a fragmented memory of his hands pulling me from the river, of his voice telling me I would be all right, of being saved by someone I'd spent years trying to find connections to. "You knew him," I managed. "Yes." "You were friends." "Yes." "Why did he leave?" Gabriel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decade's worth of unanswered questions. "That's what I've been trying to understand since the day he disappeared. He left without explanation, without goodbye. He left me wondering if the friendship meant nothing, if the partnership was a lie, if everything we built together was going to collapse without him." He paused, and I heard the old pain in that silence, the kind that didn't fade with time, only deepened. "Your father was a good man," Gabriel continued. "Better than me, better than most people I've known. And I have no idea why he chose to vanish." I picked up the photograph with trembling hands. 3 people who'd been happy once. 3 people who'd been connected. 2 of them were still alive, both holding pieces of a puzzle that neither fully understood. "Why did you save me?" I asked. Gabriel stood, offered me his hand. After a moment, I took it. His grip was warm, steady, the grip of someone accustomed to holding things firmly. "Because," he said, "when I pulled you from the water and heard that name, I realized I might finally get answers about what happened to Marcus. And because it's possible that saving his daughter was the closest I'd come in 10 years to feeling absolved of whatever failure allowed him to leave in the first place. 33 hours in Gabriel's home taught me that captivity comes in many forms. I wasn't locked in a room. The doors opened when I pushed them. Food appeared on tables without anyone forcing it down my throat. Yet I remained trapped, the invisible walls of his authority more effective than any chain. Gabriel questioned me on the second morning. Not brutally. He sat across from me at a dining table that could seat 20, drinking espresso from a small cup, watching me with the patience of someone who understood that information extracted through pressure often came out distorted. He wanted truth, not panic. "Tell me about your investigation," he said. I chose my words carefully. "My father disappeared when I was 18. The police declared him dead. I didn't believe them. Why not? Because they didn't look very hard. Because the paperwork seemed rushed. Because nobody in my family got real closure. And I wasn't willing to accept that." Gabriel set down his cup. "So you became a journalist." "I became a lot of things. A journalist was just the most useful one." He leaned back in his chair, studying me the way a collector might examine a painting with a hidden signature. "You found a pattern connecting disappearances to my organization." "Yes. And you thought investigating a warehouse in the middle of the night alone was a rational strategy? I thought it was necessary. Necessary for what? To get yourself killed? To confirm suspicions that might have no basis in reality? His voice remained level, but I detected frustration underneath. What exactly were you hoping to find? I set down my fork. The food had gone cold anyway. Information. Proof. Something that would explain where he went and why nobody could tell me the truth. Gabriel was quiet for a long moment. His eyes moved across my face like he was reading text in a language he'd almost forgotten. Your father's name wasn't Marcus Richardson when I knew him. The statement landed like a grenade. I forced myself to keep breathing, to maintain the facade of composure even as my mind raced through implications. In the organization, he went by Phantom. That was his operational designation. He worked for my family for 3 years before he disappeared. Gabriel rose from the table and moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back. I trusted him completely. He was my closest advisor on certain matters. We discussed business, politics, the structure of the organization. I told him things I told no one else. What kind of things? I asked carefully. That's not relevant to what I'm about to tell you. He turned back to face me. Marcus came to me one evening, approximately 10 years ago. He told me he was leaving. That night, he said it was necessary for his safety and the safety of his family. I asked him why, and he refused to answer. He simply said that if I valued our friendship, I would accept his departure without questions, and I would never attempt to find him. My throat tightened. And you let him go. I didn't have a choice. Marcus was intelligent enough to understand that if I pursued him, it would become a matter of organizational obligation rather than personal friendship. He was protecting me by removing the situation before it escalated. Gabriel returned to the table. What I want to understand is how his daughter ended up investigating crimes connected to my organization. How does someone go from private grief to public investigation without someone noticing? How did you stay invisible long enough to become dangerous? I couldn't answer honestly without revealing just how long I'd been digging, how many small sources I'd cultivated, how carefully I'd constructed a narrative that made sense only to me. Honesty would expose the depth of my obsession, but lying would give him reason to distrust everything I said going forward. I started small, I finally said, looking at public records, deaths that didn't make sense, disappearances that the police closed too quickly. Most leads went nowhere. Some led to people who worked for you. I connected dots that probably should have stayed unconnected, but you connected them anyway. Yes. Gabriel studied me with an expression I couldn't decode. Not anger, not disappointment. Something more complex. Your father would be furious with you, taking risks like that, drawing attention, becoming the kind of liability that organizations like mine eliminate without hesitation. He's not here to be furious, I said quietly. No, he's not. Gabriel moved to the window again, this time looking out at the grounds beyond the glass. I've spent 10 years wondering what I did wrong. What aspect of our partnership was false? What I missed that made him desperate enough to run in the middle of the night? He paused. Now I'm wondering if perhaps he ran precisely to keep me from finding out something that would have destroyed our friendship. I understood what he was offering. An alliance based on mutual need. He wanted answers about my father. I wanted the same answers. Together we might find them. Separately, we would remain stuck in our respective forms of grief. I need to call my editor, I said. He'll be looking for me. Your editor thinks you're in Wisconsin researching a story about rural property development. You texted him that you had a source who didn't want contact until you had substantive material. The message came from your phone, from this location. It's about a 3-hour drive after I brought you here. Horror flooded through me. You impersonated me. I protected you. There's a difference. Gabriel turned from the window. Your editor isn't searching for you because he believes you're fine. Your phone has been silent because I needed time to understand who you are and what you represent before other people started asking questions. That's not protection. That's manipulation. Yes, it is. He didn't deny it. In my experience, Jessica, those two things are often indistinguishable. The question is whether the manipulation serves your interests or works against them. I stood from the table. My legs felt unsteady, but I forced myself to move toward him. What do you want from me? I want you to help me find your father. I want you to use the investigation skills you've developed over 8 years to answer questions I've carried for a decade. In exchange, I will provide you with resources that no freelance journalist could access independently. We will search together, and whatever we find, I will help you determine how much of it belongs in a published story and how much belongs in the spaces between official record and truth. And if what we find implicates you, something that might have been respect crossed his face, then we'll deal with that when we reach it. But I suspect what we'll find implicates me far less than it implicates the people who made Marcus desperate enough to disappear. I realized then that I could leave. Gabriel had told me as much. The gates would open. The roads would carry me toward the life I'd been living before the river pulled me under. I could publish speculation without proof. I could alert the authorities to my knowledge. I could do many things that felt like freedom and tasted like defeat. Or I could stay. I could use the resources of a man with power and information. I could finally discover what happened to my father. The danger was obvious. The manipulation was explicit. But the alternative was to remain forever trapped in the small prison of not knowing. Teach me your business, I said. Help me understand how it works. Then tell me where my father fit into it. Everything. From the beginning. Gabriel nodded slowly. All right. But understand what you're agreeing to. Once you understand how the Sassolini organization operates, you become dangerous to people who prefer ignorance. There's no going back from that knowledge. There's no going back from jumping into a river, I replied. At least this way I chose my consequences. He almost smiled at that. A brief flicker of something that looked like approval. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful expression of a man about to share secrets that could destroy him. We'll start with your father, he said, because understanding him is the only way to understand why he left. Gabriel's archives occupied the 3rd floor of his home, a climate-controlled vault that would make any museum curator weep with envy. Rows of filing cabinets in polished steel. Servers humming in a secure room behind reinforced glass. My father's history, catalogued and preserved like evidence in a case that had never officially closed. Your father handled acquisitions, Gabriel explained, pulling a leather folder from a drawer marked 1997-2005. Property deals mostly. Construction contracts. He was brilliant at identifying undervalued assets and positioning them for development. The organization would acquire land through legitimate companies, improve infrastructure, then sell at exponential profit margins. I reviewed documents dated from the year I was born. Permits, environmental assessments, transfer documents. My father's signature on everything. Marcus Richardson, listed as project coordinator. The work was meticulous, organized, the signature of someone who took pride in precision. He never worked directly on the violent side of operations, Gabriel continued, handing me another file. I protected him from that. He was too valuable to waste on street-level enforcement. Besides, Marcus had principles I didn't share. He wanted income without bloodshed when possible. I tolerated that because his financial contributions more than compensated for his squeamishness. We spent the next 3 days in those archives. Gabriel teaching me the infrastructure of organized crime the way a professor might explain economics or engineering. How money moved through legitimate businesses to obscure its origins. How political connections ensured permits for projects that should have been rejected. How police departments received regular donations that didn't appear in any official records. My editor called on the 4th day. Richardson, where the hell are you? His voice crackled through the phone I'd finally retrieved from Gabriel's security office. You've been gone for a week. The Wisconsin story is dead. I need you back in Chicago, or I need to know you're not coming back. I was sitting in Gabriel's library, surrounded by documents that detailed my father's life in ways my mother had never managed to articulate. I'm working on something bigger, I said carefully. A real story. Not the rural development piece. I don't care if you're working on the biggest story of the decade. You're a freelancer, Jessica. You work for multiple outlets. You can't just disappear into the Wisconsin wilderness for 7 days without communication. Guilt twisted through my chest. He was right. I'd violated basic professional protocols. I need 2 more weeks, maybe 3. I'll have something concrete then. 2 weeks. Jessica, I've got a pipeline of stories. If you want work, you need to commit to deadlines. The lie came smoothly. Years of investigation had taught me how to construct narratives that felt real, even when they weren't. A source finally contacted me. Someone with direct knowledge of connections between city development and organized crime. I have one shot at this. If I break the connection now, the source disappears. Silence on the other end. I heard him calculating, understanding that a real story about organized crime and municipal corruption was exactly the kind of piece that could elevate both our careers. 3 weeks maximum, he finally said. Then you deliver, or you're done. Understood? I confirmed and ended the call. Gabriel watched me from across the library with an expression I couldn't quite read. Your editor is suspicious, he said. He's demanding. There's a difference. In my experience, there often isn't. Gabriel closed the file he'd been reviewing. We need to accelerate the timeline. If your editor is pressuring you for results, it won't be long before he decides to find out where you actually are. And if he asks the right questions, the wrong people will provide answers. What wrong people? I asked, though I suspected I knew. Dante Verciani is my business partner. Has been for 15 years. He handles operations I prefer not to be directly involved with. Distribution networks. Enforcement. The aspects of this world that require fewer ethical constraints. Gabriel moved to the window. He also has connections to journalists through various intermediaries. If your editor starts asking about you, there's a reasonable chance Verciani hears about it. The implication settled into my bones like cold water. You think he'll come looking for me? I think it's possible. Which means we need to understand what happened to your father before that becomes a problem. Over the next 2 weeks, Gabriel and I visited locations connected to my father's work. An office building in the financial district that housed shell companies. A construction site on the south side, where a community center had been built on land my father had negotiated. A warehouse near the docks where legitimate imports of Italian wines arrived monthly, though Gabriel admitted the wine was a secondary commodity to whatever else moved through the facility. At each location, Gabriel revealed pieces of the story he'd constructed in the decade since Marcus disappeared. 3 weeks before he left, your father requested a private meeting. He told me that he'd discovered something during a routine inspection of properties we were acquiring. Something that suggested corruption in the upper ranks of the organization. Specifically, he suspected that one of my trusted advisors was selling operational information to a rival family. Verciani? I asked. I didn't know that at the time. But yes, probably. Your father was careful with accusations. He had documentation, he said. Proof. He wanted to present it to me privately, because going through official channels might result in information leakage if the corruption ran deeper than he suspected. But he never presented the proof, I said. No. The next day, he came to me and said he'd changed his mind, said the evidence was inconclusive, that he'd been paranoid. He asked me to forget the entire conversation. Gabriel's voice carried the weight of a decade-old betrayal. I assumed he'd been threatened, that someone learned about his investigation and convinced him to back away. I nearly ordered a full internal investigation, but Marcus begged me not to. Said that if I pursued it, he'd be marked as a liability. Said the safest thing for everyone was to let it go. And you did. I did. Because he was my best friend, and he was asking me to trust him. 2 days later, he was gone. I processed this information while staring out at the Chicago skyline. My father hadn't abandoned Gabriel out of malice or betrayal. He'd sacrificed their friendship to protect him. He thought you were involved, I said quietly. He found evidence that Verciani was compromised, but he couldn't be sure how deep the corruption ran. He couldn't risk you becoming a target by investigating, so he disappeared rather than put you in danger. Gabriel didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. That's what I've suspected for the last decade. But suspicion and certainty are different things, Jessica. I need to know for sure. How? We have to find him, Gabriel said simply. We have to locate your father and ask him directly what he discovered, what he feared, and why he thought disappearing was preferable to trusting me with the truth. The weight of that task settled between us. My father had vanished deliberately, carefully, leaving no traces. The official record said he was dead. Any other trail had been buried under 10 years of intentional obscurity. but Gabriel had resources I'd never possessed. Connections within federal agencies, access to informants, the kind of organizational power that could move through bureaucratic channels that would take journalists months to navigate. And I had something equally valuable. I had legitimacy. I had credentials. I had the ability to ask questions publicly, without arousing the same level of suspicion that would surround Gabriel's inquiries. Together, we began searching for a ghost who'd become human through his choice to vanish. The investigation that had consumed 8 years of my life suddenly felt less like obsession and more like necessity. We weren't looking for my father to expose him. We were looking for him to understand him. And somewhere in that distinction lay the truth that had eluded me since he disappeared. That evening, alone in my guest room, I found myself wondering if proximity to Gabriel was clouding my judgment, whether the authority in his voice and the certainty in his movements were making me forget that he was, fundamentally, a criminal, whether my need for answers had made me complicit in something I didn't fully understand. But those doubts faded when I thought about my father's choice. He'd trusted Gabriel enough to sacrifice their friendship. He'd believed in the man's essential goodness strongly enough to protect him through disappearance rather than betrayal. If Marcus had trusted him, maybe I could too. At least for now. At least until we found the truth that both of us had been searching for in different ways. The pressure from my editor intensified on the 4th day of investigating with Gabriel. 3 calls in succession, each one more demanding than the last. I sat in Gabriel's office, phone pressed to my ear, trying to construct explanations that wouldn't trigger further suspicion. "I need something concrete," my editor repeated. His tone had shifted from curiosity to calculation. "Right now you have theories and fragments. Organize them into an actual narrative or find a new assignment." After we disconnected, I sat in silence. Gabriel watched from behind his desk, understanding without explanation what the conversation had cost me. "He's losing patience," I said. "Your editor isn't the problem," Gabriel replied quietly. He set down his phone and moved to the window. "One of my associates just informed me that Dante Versiani has been asking questions about you. Specifically about your background. About your work as a journalist. About your recent disappearance." The air in the room seemed to thin. "How did he find out about me?" "He's had people monitoring your apartment. When you didn't return for a week, he became curious. He has contacts within journalism circles. It didn't take long for someone to mention that you'd been investigating connections to organized crime." Gabriel turned from the window, and his expression had hardened into something colder than I'd seen since the river. "Versiani is smart enough to understand that a journalist investigating your father's disappearance could eventually connect dots that lead directly to him, which means you've become dangerous to him. And dangerous people don't remain alive very long in his calculus. What will he do? He'll try to eliminate the threat. You." The statement landed without inflection, just fact. Gabriel moved closer, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the controlled fury beneath his composed exterior. "I'm moving you," he said. "Tonight. We're leaving Chicago." "No." The refusal came automatically. "I'm not running again. My father ran. I'm not doing the same thing. Jessica, we're close to finding him. You said so yourself. 2 more days, maybe 3, and your contact in the federal program would have location information. I'm not abandoning that. Not now." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "You would choose pursuit over survival? I would choose answers over safety." He studied me with an intensity that made my skin feel exposed. "Then we do this differently. You don't go anywhere alone. You stay within protective distance from my people. And if Versiani makes a move, we respond decisively." We didn't wait long for that response to become necessary. The following morning, I left Gabriel's home for a controlled meeting with my editor. Gabriel insisted on preparation, on establishing protocols. I wore a wire disguised as a necklace. 2 of his men followed at discreet distance. Another pair waited near the... When I was 9, my father taught me to make a list with 2 columns. What we know, what we are pretending to know. He made me label the second column in red. "Most mistakes wear the right uniform," he said, handing me a pencil that had been sharpened down to a stubborn nub. I asked why we had to color code lies. "Because you will forget which is which when you are tired." He did not raise his voice then either. He drew a box around the last red line and told me to sleep. That night, I'd hidden the list under my pillow like it was talisman or teeth for a ritual I didn't understand. Years later, standing in a borrowed kitchen staring at an open laptop, I drew the same box in the margin of my notes. The line inside it was simple. I don't know how this ends. The pencil didn't make me brave. It just made the page honest enough that I could keep going. Cafe the Marshals had pre-cleared for sightlines and exits where I'd agreed to meet. My editor arrived carrying his usual coffee and his usual expression of mild annoyance. He didn't notice the surveillance. He didn't notice anything except his irritation at my continued vagueness. "I need specifics," he said before I'd even sat down. "Names, dates, evidence. Right now you're asking me to trust a source I've never met about a story that sounds like conspiracy fiction." I was constructing a response when the black sedan pulled up to the curb outside. The extraction happened with precision. Multiple men in business casual clothing moved with choreography that suggested extensive planning. They surrounded my editor and me before I understood what was happening. One of them reached for my arm. The necklace transmitted my distress directly to Gabriel's security team. The response was violent and immediate. Gabriel's people materialized from the crowd like they'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Bodies moved. Voices escalated. My editor dove behind a table with impressive instinct for someone with no combat training. I was pulled backward, away from the sedan, away from the men trying to secure me. Gabriel emerged from a parked car, moving with controlled fury. His eyes found mine for one moment, and then his attention shifted entirely to the threat. The confrontation lasted maybe 3 minutes. No gunshots. That surprised me. Gabriel had chosen to keep the violence below the level that would attract police attention. His people were trained to subdue and extract, without attracting the kind of notice that brought law enforcement into the equation. One of Versiani's men broke free and ran. Gabriel didn't pursue. He simply watched him disappear into the Chicago street noise, cataloging the escape, filing it for later consideration. "You're all right," he said, hands on my shoulders, checking for injury. "You're all right." But I wasn't all right. I was shaking from adrenaline and terror, and the visceral realization that the world I'd been investigating intellectually was suddenly very real. These were actual threats. Actual violence. Not abstract concepts or theoretical possibilities, but flesh and blood, and the knowledge that people would genuinely hurt me to protect their interests. My editor stood up from behind the table, expressions cycling through shock and fear, and then settling into professional calculation. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. "Exactly the story you wanted," I said, my voice steadier than my hands. "Now you understand why I couldn't give you details before you understood the stakes." Gabriel guided me back to his car. The streets felt dangerous now, every shadow containing potential threat. Inside the vehicle, with doors sealed and security protocols active, I finally allowed myself to breathe properly. "We're leaving Chicago tonight," Gabriel said. It wasn't a request this time. I wanted to argue. Instead, I asked the question that mattered. "Can we find him first, before we leave?" "My father." "Can we locate him before Versiani realizes what we're doing?" Gabriel was quiet for a long moment. "My contact confirmed location information this morning. Your father is in Madison." On the highway to Madison, the city unspooled behind us, until it was only a rumor in the rear view. Marcus drove like the road owed him nothing. We spoke in notes more than sentences, plates we'd seen, a billboard with a phone number that didn't match the brand, the fact that a black SUV took the same exit, and then thought better of it. Evasive routing isn't glamour. It's silence and coffee that tastes like scorched paper, and the discipline not to accelerate when you're scared. I tried to imagine what I would say when we arrived. What a daughter says to a man who taught her to ask why, and then became the answer no one wanted. Marcus didn't offer comfort. He offered tasks. "Count the turns," he said. "If they take your phone, you still have math." I stared at the mile markers, at the grain silos pretending to be landmarks. This wasn't escape or pursuit. It was a narrowing, a funnel that ended with a door, and a father, and a question I had rehearsed and still did not know how to ask. Protective custody through a federal program. It's about a 3-hour drive. 3 hours. Between Chicago and my father stood 3 hours and the knowledge that Verciani would now be searching for both Gabriel and me, not to capture or interrogate, to eliminate the complications we represented. We go tonight, I confirmed. We get to him before Verciani understands where we're heading. Gabriel's hand found mine. The contact was unexpected, but I didn't pull away. His thumb traced small circles on my wrist, and for a moment the predator became something closer to human. Someone capable of protecting what mattered. Someone willing to drive 3 hours into danger, because a woman he'd known for less than 2 weeks needed answers about her father. If we're doing this, he said quietly, you need to understand something. Once we locate your father, everything changes. Whatever he tells us about why he disappeared, about what Verciani did, about the corruption in my organization, that knowledge becomes dangerous. It becomes the kind of information that either needs to stay secret or needs to be exposed in ways that will destroy my operation and possibly put your life in permanent jeopardy. I understand. Do you? His eyes held mine. Because once you have that information, Jessica, there's no going back to the life you had before. You'll be changed. Both of us will be. I thought about the woman I'd been before the river pulled me under. The woman obsessed with ghosts and patterns, and truth existing in spaces no one wanted to examine. The woman who'd been willing to risk everything for answers. Take me to my father, I said. Everything else we'll face when we have to. Gabriel drove us through the Chicago night toward answers that waited 3 hours away in Madison. Behind us, the city receded into darkness. Ahead of us lay the possibility of finally understanding why my father had chosen to vanish. And somewhere in the space between past and future, the truth that would either bind us together or destroy us completely. The safe house sat on a quiet residential street in Madison, a 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a white picket fence that screamed normalcy. Gabriel parked 2 blocks away and we walked the distance in silence, our footsteps deliberate and measured. His security team had already confirmed the location was secure, that no one had followed us from Chicago, that the federal marshals assigned to my father's protection were expecting our arrival. The door opened before we could knock. A man in his mid-50s stood in the threshold, and for a moment I couldn't reconcile the image with my memories. 10 years had marked him. Gray had invaded his dark hair completely. His face carried lines that spoke of chronic stress and sleepless nights. But his eyes were exactly as I remembered. Sharp, intelligent, carrying the weight of secrets. Jessica, he said, and my name in his voice broke something inside me that I didn't know was broken. My God, you're all grown up. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe properly. Gabriel placed a steady hand on my lower back, and the contact grounded me enough to step forward. Marcus Richardson looked past me to Gabriel, and recognition flickered across his face. Recognition and something else. Guilt, maybe. Or regret. He extended his hand, and Gabriel accepted it with a grip that lasted longer than a normal greeting. You came, Marcus said quietly. My daughter led me here. Gabriel replied. The words were measured, controlled, but I detected the emotion underneath. Decade-old rage and hurt and confusion compressed into 3 words. We moved inside. The house was sparse, impersonal, the kind of temporary dwelling that people occupied without leaving traces. Federal protection meant isolation. It meant assuming a new identity and abandoning the life you'd built. It meant looking at photographs of your child through a screen and wondering if you'd made the right choice. Marcus sat across from both of us, and the interrogation began without formal preamble. Why? Gabriel asked. 10 years. Why disappear without telling me? Because you would have asked me to stay, Marcus said quietly, and if I stayed, you would have been in danger. The moment I discovered what Dante was doing, the moment I understood the scope of the corruption, I became a liability. But more than that, I became a threat to you. I leaned forward. What did you discover? Marcus looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite parse. Sadness, love, regret all layered together. Dante wasn't just selling information to rival organizations. He was selling operational details to multiple families. The Russians, the Gulf Cartel, even the Verciani family from the old country. He was building a network that would have allowed outside organizations to either control or destroy the Sassolini operation from within. Gabriel's jaw tightened. I suspected as much after you disappeared, but I couldn't prove it, because I took the proof with me, Marcus continued. I had documentation, bank records, communication logs, everything necessary to expose him completely. I was going to present it to you, but I realized something that night. I realized that even if you believed me, even if you wanted to act against Dante, his reach extended into places that made him dangerous. He had connections to federal agencies. He had protection that I didn't understand the full scope of. So you ran, I said. It wasn't accusatory, just observation. I ran because staying would have turned me into leverage. Dante would have realized eventually that I knew what he was doing. He would have used Jessica. Marcus looked at me with anguish. To force my compliance or my silence. By disappearing, by entering the federal program, I became worthless to him. I removed the liability. You also removed yourself, Gabriel said quietly. From my life. From our friendship. Marcus stood and moved to the window. Outside, Madison's residential streets carried on with ordinary people living ordinary lives. I couldn't tell you the truth without putting you in an impossible position. You would have had to choose between prosecuting your partner and protecting your operation. Either choice would have destroyed you. So I made the choice for you. I left. And I've spent 10 years watching from a distance, reading about the Sassolini organization through encrypted channels, knowing that you survived without me, but never being certain you were thriving. I survived because I understood that something fundamental had changed, Gabriel said. Your disappearance forced me to examine my organization differently. It forced me to be suspicious. It made me paranoid enough to survive another decade of Vertiani's slow betrayal. I watched the two men reconcile with the vocabulary of old friends who'd been separated by circumstance rather than malice. The anger in Gabriel's voice was real, but so was the understanding. My father hadn't abandoned him. My father had protected him the only way he knew how. What happens now? Marcus asked. Gabriel glanced at me, then back to Marcus. Now we stop protecting Dante through silence. We expose him. We use Jessica's credentials as a journalist to legitimize the information. We make the evidence public in a way that protects both you and me while destroying him completely. That will implicate you, Marcus said. People will know you were involved in operations that I've been involved in my entire life, Gabriel interrupted. But I've built my organization on the principle that I don't prey on innocents, and I don't traffic in information that damages people who can't defend themselves. Dante violated both principles. More than that, he violated the trust I placed in him. So yes, some of what becomes public will damage me, but it will destroy him, and that's an acceptable exchange. Federal marshals moved through the background of our conversation, preparing documents and secure communications that would allow Jessica to coordinate with authorities while protecting Marcus's location. The mechanics of dismantling a decade of careful corruption began unfolding around us. I sat with my father alone for a few moments while Gabriel coordinated logistics. I'm sorry, he said simply. For what? For missing your life, for not being there, for choosing organizational loyalty over my own daughter. I realized then that 10 years of his absence hadn't been abandonment. It had been sacrifice, the kind of choice that looked selfish from the outside, but was rooted in protection and love. Gabriel has been kind to me, I said. Since the river. Marcus nodded slowly. Gabriel is a good man in terrible circumstances. He's always been that way. When I realized I had to leave, knowing he would be the one person I left behind, was the hardest part. We didn't resolve the decade of separation in a single conversation. Reconciliation wasn't that simple, but we began the process of understanding how different choices had led us to the same moment. Different paths converging at Madison, at this small house, at the beginning of the end for Dante Verciani, and everything he'd built through betrayal. Gabriel drove us back toward Chicago as the night deepened. My father would remain in protective custody, but now with purpose. Now as a cooperating witness who would help dismantle the corruption from within. I sat in the passenger seat, watching Gabriel's profile against the darkness, understanding finally that saving me from the river hadn't been coincidence or impulse. It had been the universe offering him a second chance at the friendship he'd lost. And he was taking it. Consequences be damned. The federal building occupied an entire block in downtown Chicago, all glass and steel and the kind of architectural confidence that only government institutions seem to possess. Gabriel waited in a parking garage while I ascended to meet with Special Agent Catherine Morrison, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd spent 2 decades prosecuting organized crime cases. Agent Morrison insisted on a coordinated release, evidence first under seal, publication second under counsel's guidance. Agent Morrison laid out the plan like he was folding a map on a windy roof. No heroics. We staged the material, we locked chain of custody, we let defense hang itself on its own filings. He tapped the table twice, not for emphasis, but to mark sequence. He wanted redundancies, 2 copies, 2 couriers, 2 clocks. I don't need you brave, he said. I need you boring and on time. He walked me through the protocol for contact. A word only we would use if grabbed, a second if I needed the meeting burned. He did not raise his voice. He did not call it protection. It was housekeeping with consequences. When I asked if the article could move a day earlier, he shook his head. Evidence first under seal, publication second under counsel's guidance. Not romance, timing. I wrote the order down like it could steady my hands. He didn't smile. Good. Now do it again with your eyes closed. Not romance, timing. Your father's testimony is valuable, Morrison said, sliding a document across her desk. But testimony alone isn't enough to dismantle the entire network Versiani built. We need corroborating evidence. We need documentation that connects him to specific crimes. We need someone on the inside who can testify about his operational methods. I can provide that, I said, through journalism. I'll publish an investigation that connects Versiani to the corruption. I'll document his activities, his relationships with rival organizations, his infiltration of your agency. Everything becomes public record, which creates legal pressure and makes continued cooperation less risky for my father. In the newsroom, the lights felt colder because no one wanted to admit they were afraid. Legal sat with a stack of caveats that looked like a tower built from loss. Name what you can prove, the lawyer said. And only what you can prove. My editor watched the draft like it might leap. No poetry in the leady, she said. Not because I don't like it, but because juries don't. We argued about a single adjective for 10 minutes, and then cut the sentence entirely. Ethics wasn't a halo, it was a harness. You don't owe the audience catharsis, legal said. You owe them a path. I took out a line that made me feel brave, and replaced it with a date and an invoice number. It read colder and truer, and I hated that this was the same thing. When we finally stood up, the page looked smaller than the harm it described. That was the point. No verdicts, no victory laps. Just the door we could open, and the ones we could now close. Morrison leaned back in her chair. You understand that publishing this story will make you a target? Versiani doesn't forgive threats to his operation. Once your name is attached to these revelations, he'll consider you an enemy. I'm already his enemy, I said quietly. I've been investigating him for 8 years without knowing it. At least now I'm doing it intentionally. We spent 3 hours constructing the framework for simultaneous legal and journalistic action. My father would testify before a grand jury about specific instances of corruption. I would publish my investigation, connecting those instances into a broader narrative of betrayal and organized crime infiltration of federal agencies. The timing would be coordinated to maximize pressure on Versiani and minimize opportunities for him to flee or destroy evidence. Gabriel was waiting in the parking garage when I emerged. His expression remained controlled, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel as we drove back toward his penthouse. Versiani knows we're moving against him, Gabriel said without preamble. One of my people detected unusual activity in the organization. He's consolidating support, moving money, preparing for something. War, I said. Internal war. He's going to challenge my authority. He's going to claim that I've become weak, that my decision to investigate corruption is destabilizing the organization, that his vision is what we need to survive. Gabriel's jaw tightened. He'll frame his actions as reformation, not betrayal. And unfortunately, some of my people will believe him. That evening we gathered in Gabriel's office. His closest advisors, men I'd learned to recognize over the past weeks. Franco, his second-in-command, several regional managers. They looked at me with varying degrees of hostility, confusion, and assessment. "Jessica has agreed to publish an investigation," Gabriel announced. "The investigation will expose Dante's corruption. It will document his ties to rival organizations. It will make clear that his actions endanger all of us." "You're bringing a journalist into our business?" One of the men, a stocky figure named Antonio, looked appalled. "You're opening us to exposure." "Jessica's investigation will appear regardless of whether she has our cooperation," Gabriel replied calmly. "With our cooperation, we control the narrative. Without it, Dante controls it. I prefer to choose my vulnerabilities." The discussion lasted hours. Arguments were presented. Objections were raised and addressed. By midnight, Gabriel had secured commitment from enough senior figures that any move by Verziani would result in organizational fracture, rather than seamless transition. "You need to go somewhere safe," Gabriel told me after everyone had left. "Verziani will move against me within days. He'll try to eliminate threats. You're a threat now." A federal safe house became my residence for the next 3 days. Concrete walls, unmarked entrance. 2 marshals stationed outside. I worked constantly, compiling 8 years of investigation into narrative form. My editor called repeatedly, becoming increasingly frantic as I finally began delivering material that confirmed every suspicion he'd ever held about organized crime in Chicago. "This is Pulitzer material," he said, "assuming it doesn't get you killed." "I'm aware," I replied. Gabriel called every 12 hours, his voice carrying the strain of navigating organizational politics while preparing for confrontation. "Verziani has moved against 3 of my people, attempted to convince them to switch allegiance. One of them turned him in immediately. The other 2 pretended to consider his offer while reporting back to me. Is he going to come after you directly?" I asked. "Eventually, but not yet. He's testing the waters first, seeing how many people will support him before he makes his move." The federal prosecutors coordinated with my publication. Timing became everything. My story would publish on Monday morning. The grand jury testimony would occur Monday afternoon. By evening, Verziani would be arrested on preliminary charges. The legal apparatus would move with speed, designed to prevent his escape or destruction of evidence. I spent Sunday evening in the safe house, reviewing my article one final time. 8 years of investigation compressed into 5,000 words. My father's name wasn't mentioned, but his experience threaded through the narrative. Gabriel's organization remained unnamed in most places, referred to simply as the subject organization. But anyone in law enforcement or organized crime would understand exactly what the article described. My editor's message arrived at midnight. "Publication is locked in. No changes. You're changing the city tomorrow, Jessica. Be ready for the consequences." I understood what he meant. Once my name appeared on this story, I would become public record. My investigation would be archived in databases and news libraries. Verziani might face prosecution, but the danger wouldn't end. There would always be people connected to his organization who considered revenge appropriate response to betrayal. Gabriel arrived before dawn, before the marshals expected him, using security protocols that allowed him access to the safe house. He looked exhausted. His dark eyes held the weight of a man preparing for war against people he'd once trusted. "Your article is going to destroy him," Gabriel said quietly. "I know. It's also going to change everything. Between us. Between you and your father. Between you and this city. I know that too." He pulled me close, and I felt him trembling slightly. Not from fear. From the realization that choices made in the previous weeks had led inexorably to this moment. This threshold. After Monday morning, there would be no going back. "When this is over," he said against my hair. "When Verziani is imprisoned and the investigation is concluded, I'm going to ask you to stay. I know I shouldn't ask. I know what I am, what my organization represents, but I'm going to ask anyway." I pulled back to look at him. His scar caught the early morning light, a physical manifestation of the life he'd lived. A life of violence and power and calculated risk. "Ask me after Monday," I said. When we both understand what surviving this actually costs. He kissed me then, and it felt like a promise disguised as goodbye, like all the tension and proximity and danger of the past weeks, crystallizing into single moment of absolute clarity. Monday morning arrived with the weight of consequence. My article published at 6 a.m. exactly. Within hours, it was trending nationally. Within 8 hours, federal marshals arrested Dante Verziani at his home in the suburbs. Within 12 hours, my father sat in a federal courthouse and testified about 10 years of observation, documentation, and evidence of systematic corruption. I called my mother the night before the article ran. We didn't talk about forgiveness, only about breathing through whatever would follow. When the story broke and my father's testimony became public record, she didn't say, "I told you so." She said, "I can sleep tonight," and for the first time in a decade I believed her. The 12 names that had started everything didn't stay as red pins on my wall. In the filings unsealed after Dante's arrest, 6 appeared as employees funneled through shell contractors. 3 had life insurance anomalies tied to the same brokerage. All 12 intersected properties, Marcus flagged in his notes. I pulled the pins from the board one by one and laid the names flat like they could breathe easier on paper. There were patterns that had hid in plain sight because they wore uniforms we trusted. Vendors with one extra initial, contractors with safety records so clean they squeaked. 6 of the 12 had been hired through companies that existed only in mail drops. 3 had life insurance riders written by the same broker who made partner too young to have earned it. On Marcus's map, the intersections weren't roads. They were properties, warehouses with perfect lease histories and no footprints in winter photographs. We weren't chasing ghosts. We were closing the door behind men who thought doors were ornamental. When the filings were unsealed, the neatness of it was the insult. Dates that matched pay cycles. Approvals that landed at 4:58 p.m., signatures that shook only when the weather did. The story wouldn't resurrect anybody. It would at last call their absence by its correct name. They weren't ghosts anymore. They were evidence. The machinery of justice, when it finally moved with terrifying efficiency. The confrontation came 3 days after my article published, and my father testified. Gabriel called me to his office, and I found him standing at the window with blood on his cufflinks. Not much. Just enough to suggest someone had recently disagreed with him about organizational structure and decision-making authority. Dante tried to stage a coup, Gabriel said without preamble. He approached 6 senior members and offered them positions in a restructured organization. He promised them we were moving into decline, that federal pressure would destroy everything, that his vision was the only path forward. How many agreed? I asked. None. Gabriel turned from the window. His expression remained composed, but I could see the exhaustion underneath, because I'd already made clear to them what Dante had done. Because your article provided undeniable proof that he'd betrayed us all. Because loyalty, it turns out, still matters when you're willing to defend the people you call family. The legal machinery moved faster than I'd anticipated. Dante Verziani faced charges on 5 counts of racketeering, conspiracy, and information trafficking. His trial would take months, but the outcome seemed inevitable. Federal prosecutors had documentation. They had testimony from my father. They had my published investigation providing context and corroboration. My editor called me exactly 1 week after the initial publication. "Congratulations," he said. "We're being contacted by every major publication in the country. Requests for interviews, offers to syndicate. Your piece is being taught in journalism schools as an example of investigative reporting." He paused. "I also wanted to tell you personally that we're giving you the promotion. Full-time staff position. Benefits. Predictable income. Everything we discussed before you disappeared into that story. I accepted the position, which meant returning to my apartment. Returning to something resembling normal life. Except normal had fundamentally shifted. I couldn't walk down Michigan Avenue without people recognizing my name. My social media was flooded with messages ranging from congratulation to threats. The story had changed things, exactly as Gabriel had predicted. My father relocated from protective custody to a monitored residence in northern Illinois, close enough to Chicago that Gabriel could visit without it being obvious, far enough that he remained insulated from direct danger. The reconciliation between them was incomplete, but progressing. Two men learning to rebuild friendship across a decade of separation and sacrifice. Gabriel and I existed in the space between definition. Not quite together, not quite separate. He still controlled organized operations that extended across multiple states. I still reported for a newspaper with editorial standards that conflicted with his world. The contradiction created constant tension, the kind that kept us aware of what we were actually risking by remaining proximate. "I could leave," Gabriel said one evening as we sat in his penthouse overlooking Chicago. The city spread below us like something we both inhabited but didn't fully belong to. "I could liquidate operations, walk away from the organization, become legitimate. You wouldn't survive it," I replied quietly. "Not emotionally, not psychologically. This is who you are." "And what are you?" I considered the question carefully. "I'm someone who discovered that chasing truth doesn't always provide the kind of clarity you want. I'm someone who loves a man she shouldn't be able to love. I'm someone who's learning that moral certainty is a luxury fewer people can afford than they claim." Gabriel reached for my hand. The contact was gentle, which somehow made it more intense than any dramatic gesture. "I want you to stay. I know, but you're not going to decide tonight." "No," I agreed. "I'm going to decide every morning whether staying is still the right choice. And maybe that's the most honest thing I can do with both of us." My editor didn't ask questions when I remained in Chicago instead of moving to the main office. He simply sent assignments my way, work that allowed me to maintain proximity to sources and stories that emerged from the chaos Verziani's arrest had triggered. Federal investigations expanded. Organizational restructuring became news. And I reported it all with the careful balance of someone who understood both sides of the conflict. After the story ran, the city didn't fall apart. It flinched. Phones learned a new rhythm. Doors learned to pause before they opened. Anonymous tips arrived like weather. Noisy, mostly wrong, occasionally clean. Morrison throttled access until rumor starved. Marcus left the board up but took the pins down. Holes in cork felt truer than thread. I bought a second lock and a quieter kettle. A neighbor I barely knew started walking his dog on my block at the right hours and never said a word about it. None of that was victory. It was maintenance. The kind of work you do when you accept that justice doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like paperwork that finally adds up. At night, I would reread the paragraph where the facts held hands across the page and remember that I had not been brave, only thorough. Some mornings that was enough. On the others, I borrowed against the quiet and paid it back by noon. 3 months after Verziani's arrest, my father joined Gabriel and me for dinner at a restaurant Gabriel didn't own, but had connections to. The meal was awkward in the way that reconciliation always is, people trying to rebuild bridges across chasms that had seemed unbridgeable. But it was happening. Progress emerged in fragments. "I don't expect forgiveness," my father said to Gabriel during the meal, "for disappearing, for taking the decision away from you. I don't expect it either," Gabriel replied, "for not pursuing you harder, for allowing doubt to overcome friendship." They were both right, both wrong, both capable of understanding the other's perspective while still carrying the weight of their choices. That night, back at Gabriel's penthouse, I stood on the balcony looking down at the city. Lights reflected off the Chicago River, turning it into something beautiful, despite knowing what lay underneath. Dante Verziani sat in a federal holding facility waiting trial. My father was learning to exist outside protective custody. My editor had accepted that I would work remotely from Chicago indefinitely. Gabriel had consolidated organizational authority and begun implementing reforms that reduced direct violence while maintaining operational effectiveness. Everything had changed. Nothing had fundamentally altered. "Are you thinking about staying?" Gabriel asked, joining me on the balcony. "I'm thinking that I don't have a choice anymore," I said. "I'm too connected now. To you, to my father, to this city and what it represents. Leaving would be retreat, and I'm finished retreating." Gabriel pulled me close, and I let myself exist in that moment without analyzing it, without projecting futures that might never arrive. The wind off the lake carried the smell of water and Chicago in October, and somewhere below us, the city continued its ordinary business, unaware that small moments of connection were being negotiated in high buildings above their heads. What happens when Verziani's trial ends? I asked. We'll deal with that when it arrives. And when federal prosecutors start looking more closely at your operations. Same answer. I understood then that he wasn't asking me to save him or fix him or be his redemption. He was simply asking me to stay. Knowing that I understood exactly what staying meant. That I was choosing proximity to a man who would never be entirely legitimate. That I was accepting a life built on contradictions and compromise. My phone buzzed with a message from my editor. Another investigation lead. Another potential story. I would pursue it tomorrow, maintaining the work that had consumed 8 years of my life before Gabriel existed in it. I would continue being the journalist who exposed corruption. I would continue being Jessica Richardson, the woman who jumped into a river and been pulled out by a man who understood sacrifice better than most people understood anything. For now, though, I existed in the space between roles. Between the woman I'd been and the woman I was becoming. Between the city below and the man beside me and the choices we were both making, moment by moment, day by day, without requiring certainty or promises or futures we couldn't control. The river continued moving beneath Chicago's streets, carrying secrets and stories toward destinations unknown. And I remained above it, finally understanding that sometimes survival meant learning to live with the questions, instead of waiting for answers that might never arrive.